morning, everyone. This is a website that you can record for your sightings. I don't know, probably most of you have seen birds around Brisbane City. So this is how the website looks like. And today I will give you a very quick look how you can register and how you can add your sightings. So the first thing is how you can join this website. You just need to register, put your name, a password. If you are a member of any group, just put, if you are B4C, you can add B4C as a group. And then just submit your registration. It's in that order. And then once you are registered, you log in with your username and with your password. And then you log in there, and once you are logged on, you go to enter your data and how that looks like for entering data. And you just need to put the date and click on the map, the specific location that you saw the bird or the group of birds. If you want to share your data, because this is your personal data, you need to send us an email telling that you want to be part of the group. B4C has joined Scan, and we have a group of people that share the data with us. So you just send us an email, and then you will receive an invitation that you will start sharing your data with us. So far, this is a map how it looks like. You can see much from there, but once you are in the map, you will see all the members' data. Last year we sent invitation, and many of you already received this is a list of the people that already are sharing their data with us. And we also still have a list with pending people that so far haven't accepted yet this invitation. Coming up in March, we will have 2 workshops the same day. One of them is Introduction to Control of Mynas and Cage Capture and Management, and a second is how to build cages. The date is the 14th of March, so if you are interested, just send us an email that you would like to participate in this workshop. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to help you after the presentation. If you want to know about this Scanner, but you have your brochures, I think you will have information there. Thank you.
While we're just swapping the pictures over, Lee from our nursery and the other volunteers have made a selection of plants this morning that are just on a rack just near where you came and signed in. Gold coin donation in those, so there's all sorts of different plants that are suitable for home gardens if you'd like to make a selection of them. Obviously you're also able to buy some of the other ones out in the nursery as well, but if you'd like to make a selection of those, that would be brilliant as well. So while Adrian's finding his spot on the PowerPoint, Adrian's an ecologist that Bulimba Creek has been working with for umpteen years now, and very well known around the Brisbane, southeast Queensland area, and all sorts of ecological activities. So this time we've asked him to speak about wetlands in particular because the 2nd of February was World Wetland Day. So we thought ecology is such a huge topic, we need to just narrow him down a little bit. So Adrian's going to talk about wetlands, and then after the presentation then we'll do morning tea outside. So hopefully won't be too hot in here, we'll survive. Julie's actually going to be filming Adrian, and we're hoping to be able to put it then up on our website and let people know that couldn't come to get a little bit more from Adrian. So thank you, Adrian, and everybody enjoy what this wonderful man has to say.
Thank you very much. So today's topic, yes, wetlands, and certainly when we say the term wetlands, there's so much that could be talked about when it comes to wetlands. So objective today is to get information across to people and to help with learning. So obviously, if you've got a question or you've got something that's related to what I'm talking about, please just stick your hand up or call out and get a bit of interaction going on different things. Now, when you get asked to talk about wetlands, you start to wonder, what is a wetland? And a wetland gets defined by many people in many different ways, and there's legislation that determines what a wetland is. There's sort of various views on different wetlands, and a wetland technically is anywhere which has water, whether permanent, semi-permanent, or even occasional. An overland flow path is technically a wetland when there's water running through it. And all of these different areas have different values. We have in Australia a wide range of wetlands, and wetlands are an important part, not just in Australia, but everywhere, an important part of what is the local ecology and the local biology of what's present in an area. We have areas down in central Australia and down through the middle there that hardly ever have water. They can go 15, 20 years without having water, and then all of a sudden in the big wets, those areas fill up and we'll get thousands and thousands of birds and fish and things suddenly appear there. And you really wonder how they know. One of the great mysteries, the pelicans that all sit out in our bay here, all of a sudden they all leave. And they all go inland. And the rain hasn't even happened yet. And somehow, by the time they get inland, the water's hit and there's inland lakes are filled up and those birds are in there and they're breeding. Marine environments are also wetlands. We have marine wetlands, we have freshwater wetlands, we have all sorts of various wetlands that can be used and utilised by a variety of species. And obviously an area like this, at high tide, most of the ground's covered. There's always still got some areas there that wader birds and things like that are using to roost. And then as that tide recedes, the mudflats get exposed and a whole lot of feeding activity and other things start to happen. I think I'm pushing the right button here. A bit local, but when you look and think about our bay, and the nearby bay area there, so that's the southern Moreton Bay Islands basically, which isn't far, just down the road here. And you look at an area like that, and the variety of wetlands that comes into a photo like that, it's quite impressive. There's all the man-made dams and farm dams and things like that. There's the freshwater creeks, the waterways. There's the larger marine environments. There's the ocean front and the sandy beaches and those areas there. You've got the great swamp that runs on Stradbroke Island, the 18-mile swamp, which is totally fresh water and pushed up by the salt water underneath it, through to the estuarine areas, which are salty to the north, and as you come further to the south to get fresh water and ultimately run into the Logan River there. And for some species, they're only found in some areas of that, and other species at different times utilise a whole variety and a whole different range of it. It's a great photo. What I love about this photo is it's easy to demonstrate to people how North Stradbroke Island was once connected to the mainland. And you can see it there where that water sinks the road and cut through and moved its way through. Wetlands are dynamic environments. People love wetlands, whether they're marine, and that's out at Point Lookout, and obviously an attractive area that brings people in. But wetlands aren't always seen as attractive. I certainly know that, your average person out there refers to wetlands as dirty swamps and things like that. There's a lot of names for wetlands that are rather derogatory and aren't really invoking sort of any kind of affiliation with those wetlands from various people. And it's something that, is a challenge. Our marine environments, we live in a magic part of the world here. We often forget that southeast Queensland is one of the most biodiverse areas in the world. Brisbane City is the most biodiverse capital city in the world. We have more species, more animals, we share our lives with more things than any other capital city in the world. And wetlands are certainly somewhere that plays a role in that. What we do and how we live determines how healthy and how much viability is actually in our wetland areas. Little old mate here, bushstone curlew. Not many people think of that as a wetland species, and it's not really. It will live around wetlands and it will live nearby wetlands, but it is actually a wader. It's traditionally, it's the same as the little birds that you see out in the intertidal areas, and its evolution comes from wetland environments. But these days it tends to live, you know, it's more one of those species that lives basically on high dry earth. Rarely does it go into the mud, but come summertime they'll hit the coastal, the big salt pans and the clay pans that are on the edges of the bay, and they'll often gather there in quite large numbers at night. You'll get 40, 50, 60 birds all breeding and all calling and carrying on. This is one of these species that around here we've still got quite a few of them in various places. In fact, tonight I'm over on Coochie Mudlow Island doing on the great curlew count that happens over there every year, where we count the birds on the island and get a total. And they're doing reasonably well in certain areas. Now, areas like if there was a couple here, they wouldn't have a long future while you've still got foxes running around. It's an old world bird. This is a bird that doesn't learn. So, and when I say old world, things like kookaburras and magpies and butcher birds and noisy miners, they're new world birds. They're birds that have learnt to live with people and make the most of our environments and the urbanisations that have gone on, and it's to their advantage. These guys, unfortunately, they do what they've always done, and they rely on their camouflage to survive. Standing dead still. We have them around my office down in Cleveland, and you can walk out some days and think, oh yeah, there's a couple of curlews. You sit down and have your lunch, and by the time you finish lunch you realise there's 10 or 15 of them around you, and it takes a while to spot them and pick them out. Great camouflage. Doesn't work too well in the modern world in Australia, because unfortunately standing dead still and hoping that no one notices you, whilst it worked traditionally, when it comes to foxes, dogs, cats and cars, is not a good strategy. They're generally meat, alright? And it can fly very well. But it will stand there while the fox actually comes up, and it's just what they do. Whereas another bird like the masked lapwing, which is again one of these birds that's succeeding in our environment, it'll fly off, it'll swoop back, it'll attack the fox from the air and do all of those sorts of things to protect itself. Won't spend too long on these, but we've got species around here that bring tourists in. Our wetlands and our marine environments, so much sort of tourism and things come, but without those species, we lose so many things. We lose tourism and a lot of people's businesses and livelihoods rely on it. Yet it's so misunderstood. When you ask your average person, think of our local elections and things like that, you know, was wetlands or biodiversity even mentioned during the recent election? It just wasn't there. It wasn't one of those issues that come up. And I think back 15 years ago, election was, in any election, environment was in the top 3 issues that were being debated. And somehow these days that's all dropped off in regard to jobs and health and all of those other things. And they're all important. People love to see our wetlands. Some people don't understand how to treat wetlands or how to access them correctly. And this is taken down at just off point there at Cleveland, where you catch the ferry over to Stradbroke Island. A couple of young Japanese boys in this car. They had a tom-tom that told them where the route was. They got there at low tide and they could just see a lot of mud for a long way, and they decided, well, we must just keep driving. They've gone down the boat ramp and they kept driving. There that day, I am impressed how far they got that car out of that mud flat. I am very impressed. I've got a big 4-wheel drive. I doubt I could have got my 4-wheel drive out where they got to. And they were stuck in their car watching the ferry that they should have been on and over to the island go past. So it's funny, but it also causes a lot of damage. So where they've got tracks out on those mud flats and where that car sits there while that tide comes in, to get people a high enough tide to get something out there to actually drag that car back out of the marine park and get it up onto the land, takes, you know, and it has an impact. And to this day, at low tide, you can still see where that car went out and where it was stuck, and all the works that had to happen to get that car out of that wetland area. So wetlands are fragile. Wetlands are all over the place. We don't often think of it, but a toilet is a wetland to a lot of species. Who's got a green tree frog in their toilet? No one. Well, a couple have, all right. And certainly your downpipes, your gutters. When you've got a gutter with a bit of leaf in it and it's holding a bit of water, for some species, that's a small ephemeral wetland. And ephemeral just means semi-permanent. It dries out, gets wet again, dries out, gets wet again. And they're dynamic environments. When they're wet, they come to life and things, and when they dry out, you can go there on a rainy night and there's frogs everywhere and there's red-bellied black snakes and all sorts of things moving around, and it's alive. You can go back there a few weeks later and seems like there's absolutely nothing there. And it's all to do with the right time, the right place, and getting out and finding what's there. Who's been frogging in the last 3 to 4 months? All this rain we've had, all these lovely downpours that we've had. Who's been out to their local wetland or park or creek or school to hear what frogs they've got?
You don't have to, they're in the garden.
They're in the garden, but the ones in our gardens at home are our, I'll call them our own little pets. But it's also important to get out at the right time. It's no good going down to Tinchy Tamble wetlands or to Nippy wetlands tonight to frog and see how many frogs are there, because tonight probably not going to be a whole lot of activity. You'll pick a few up, but when you think to the storms we had a couple of weeks ago, when it's pouring rain, that's the time to get out into your local wetlands. That's the time to be able to hear and see what frogs are there. Now, a lot of people talk to me about frogs, and we'll certainly get on to some frogs in a minute. I look at that, and to me that is a classic marine environment, a marine wetland. Anyone who's into wading birds will realise that across that landscape there are a whole different range of environments. To us it looks like just one little muddy flat. But there's different, when you think about wading birds, there's some with long beaks and some with straight beaks and some with hooked beaks and all sorts of varieties. And different ones are actually going to be using different areas of this to feed. And they're after all the little marine worms and bivalves and all the things that generally live in that mud. Waded birds. Can't help but bring on waded birds into this talk. A lot of people don't realise how important waded birds are to be aware of and to manage correctly. In Australians, we have this unfortunate hobby where we like to go to a beach and let our dogs run around and chase the birds away and kids run up and down and all of those sorts of things. But those wader birds, most of those migratory waders, have flown thousands and thousands of kilometres from Siberia and other places in the Northern Hemisphere to come here for the summer to feed whilst it's snow and wet and winter over there. They feed up, and their entire job while they're here is to just feed up enough to rebuild their energy reserves in order to make the trip back in order to breed. So they're actually just visitors here, most of them. But if we consistently and constantly disturb them, we're putting a large impact on their viability of actually getting home. And these birds are going to fly. When they leave, it's cyclone season, it's storm season, they've got to pick their way. How they know their way is another one of the great mysteries that goes on around the world. Other ones are residents. Now I showed you the little stone curlew just before. Now this guy here is the beach curlew as such. Australian, it's rare bird. It's quite rare. And it's found right up and down the east coast. And certainly one that, you know, I can't stress enough that, yeah, so poorly misunderstood. Very similar in its nature to the bushstone curlew we were looking at earlier, but he only really exists along the marine foreshores. So you won't get him on the inland wetlands and around those sorts of areas. So it's one of these birds that, yeah, if ever you see one, please record it, please note it.
Are they down at Cleveland?
Yes, yeah, we do get them down around Cleveland. Rarely, but they do pop in at various times, down at Empire Point and off Wellington Point and places like that. You get them on Straddie occasionally, and certainly more associated with the biggest sandy beaches than things. But yeah, they breed just in the foredunes, raise their young in the foredunes and come out. They're feeding mostly on the invertebrates on the intertidal areas and grasshoppers and things.
There's a very big population of curlews, as you'd be aware, just immediately south of Waybreak Island, by the proposed development of Waybreak Island. One of them is
Yes.
such a disaster, massive impact
Yeah.
on the beach bird. About 20% of the population up there.
Yeah, and you know, well, some of these areas, and Waybreak Island is a good example of, as humans, we modify landscapes. And Waybreak Island is actually a modified landscape. A lot of that area was built to break the waves from bashing up the foreshore. And without knowing it, we create other environments and intertidal areas that are booming for various birds. A lot of people don't realise that mad bird watchers, one of the places that we have to go if we're near one, are sewage farms. You want to see a lot of these rarer birds, the sewage farms and where their outlets are and where they do the water treatment are the place to go and see a lot of these birds, because there's so much nutrient, so much moisture and other things going on there, and there's all the flies and the larvae and things, that's what brings the birds in, even though it's a highly modified environment. You can go down the road to the big natural wetland and there's hardly anything there because they're all up at the poo farm. That's just nature. Alright? These guys here, magpie geese. Who's seen them lately? You understand the history of these guys? Many, you know, if we go back 60 years ago, right through the east coast of Australia, right down to Victoria, in large numbers. And then, don't quote me on this, about 40 years ago, gone. Only really in the Northern Territory. And we searched and searched around all the greater Brisbane and southeast Queensland, and these birds were not here. They'd gone. And it was all for foxes, dogs, cars, loss of habitat, shooting and hunting. They are a much hunted bird, particularly up north. And you only got to look at the size of them to realise there's a hell of a feed on those birds, and certainly something that was worth hunting back in the day. They're back. Probably the last 10 years. Made a remarkable recovery, and we don't know for sure whether they've all just come south slowly or whether there's been breeding and the numbers have increased and it's pushed them down or whatever it is. But it is only because we have kept areas like Menippi parklands, and we've kept some of the larger wetland areas and some of the larger farm dams, that there's still enough environment and habitat for these guys to come back to. They are breeding in southeast Queensland again, and their numbers appear to be increasing. And look, the magic bird, one of the few good stories of our native wildlife, something that's actually come back, not just come back, but successfully breeding and successfully seems to be improving in numbers. Changes in legislation mean people aren't going down the wetland anymore and popping them off and dragging them home for the barbecue, which is probably helping an awful lot with their recovery. Little birds like this, often missed. You go to a wetland area, and I can't sort of put this into enough context, must have the water lilies, right? Now in southeast Queensland, and you go back way back when, there wasn't really any water lilies in our wetlands and our pondage areas. Most of the water lilies we have are all introduced. But this is a bird that most of our larger wetlands and pondage areas, the home-crested jacana, is found in. And I just use this bird as an indication of adaptations. It walks on the water. It must have those water lilies, and it walks around on the water lilies. It's got massively large feet. Its toes you can see right out to here. That's what keeps it on top of the water. It breeds out on that water, makes its nest, runs around on those water lilies, feeds on the insects and things around those water lilies. Put it up on high dry land and it looks like a drunk duck. Alright, can hardly get around very well. But you can only get it if you've got the right environments and the right habitats. So you can have the biggest dam in the world, but unless you've got the right amount of water lilies and things, you're not going to have that species. Other rare birds around the place, like the cotton pygmy geese and things, again, strongly associated with water lilies and living in amongst and around those water lilies. So they're one of those varieties that you can get. Now, a photo of a bat, and you sort of think, why in the hell would he put a photo of a bat when he's talking about wetlands? Any ideas? Well, if it wasn't for these guys, our wetlands would be producing so many bugs and insects and mosquitoes and everything else that life would be hell out there. We wouldn't be sitting here like this. We'd have all of these doors closed and we'd be hiding from the invertebrates that are waiting to bite us, eat us and scratch us. We misunderstand the role that these small insectivorous bats, I mean this is an animal that's about the size of a large mouse, but at night flying around, it's feeding and basically consuming almost its body weight in insects and invertebrates. And every night, Greater Brisbane area, tons and tons of invertebrates are cleaned up by these guys. And they rely on wetlands. There's quite a few of them who specialise at flying down onto the water, and they have feet which are dragging behind them, and they catch, you know, the skimmers and the water spiders that are on top of water? That's what they're feeding on. They protect them, they fly down, they grab them up and take them off. So they rely, there's certain species of bat that rely on having those open bodies of water and water there to feed on. Our old mate green tree frog, alright? Who's got one or seen one around the place? Yep, cool. Now I've got bad news for you, you're not seeing that one. Alright, that's a trick. That's the white-legged tree frog. So that's the one from northern Queensland, from about Rockhampton upwards, and almost identical to our common green tree frog, just a slight change, and you go further north and you get that one. Almost identical, same habits. You go up north, it's in their toilets, it's in their downpipes, it's in their school bubbler tanks and all of those sorts of things. So that's our local one. Doesn't have that beautiful white lip as such, so you'd still kiss it, but wouldn't you? Those ways about it. I use this frog often as an example of our role as a community. There is no reason in southeast Queensland that most of our homes and schools shouldn't have this species surviving. It is a frog. It's a lucky frog. It loves humans. It loves human environments. Now before we all turned up and started urbanising this place, they are a tree frog. They live in tree hollows, large tree hollows where they can get right down and it maintain moisture. And without that, they would dehydrate. So frog skin is like tissue paper. You sit a frog on a dry hunk of sand and you watch it just dry out like nothing, and before long it'll look like a mummified museum specimen. Alright? Ever you're handling frogs, you must have wet hands. If I was to pick a frog up now, it would be and it's not squealing because I caught it, it's squealing because the salt and the dryness of my hand is making it panic. Pick a green tree frog up with a very wet hand and it'll actually often just sit there and enjoy it. Because it's actually drinking. It'll take that water in. Airguard, sunscreen, things like that. Do not pick frogs up if you've got that on your hands. Alright? Just little note of that. But these guys, downpipes, toilets, school bubblers, frog ponds in your yard, little ditches, roadside ditches, all of those sorts of things are habitat, and they will breed quite happily in that. I've had these guys in my yard where on a good rainy night I just go out and put a couple of dishes out to hold water, they'll fill up and they'll breed in it. They don't care. Frogs have, when I say frog, 99.9% of frogs have no regard for their young. They wait for the right temperature, the right humidity, and a bit of a downpour. They go off into the wetlands or the pond areas, they breed, they lay their eggs, and then they leave. And good luck, kids. Hope it all goes well. Makes me a bit jealous, actually. But that's most frogs. We have a few frogs that actually have adapted hip pockets that they rear their frogs, their young in. We had frogs in southeast Queensland that we didn't enter around the bullets. And they were in the rainforest, the higher rainforest streams. And that was frog that actually swallowed its young. It would lay eggs and it would swallow those eggs and rear those tadpoles in its stomach. And then when they were young frogs, it would open its mouth and they would pop out. That frog's now extinct. No two ways about it. It's not been recorded for 50 odd years or something like that. You know, and there's people in this room that's gone extinct in your lifetime or in our lifetimes. That frog is unique around the world, and it was much sought after by a lot of the medical companies and things like that. Because how it can put its young in its belly and not digest them. It can turn off its stomach gastric juices somehow and have those frogs, let them out, and then go back to having a stomach to work again. And for anyone who's got to have any kind of stomach operation, you wish the medical people could get the secret of that frog, because it can do a whole lot for you. So we should have these guys. I don't know how many times I have had the question at an end of a talk like this. Adrian, yes? We used to have green tree frogs. They used to live on our back step. For years, probably 10 years we had green tree frogs. They were always there, now they're gone. Why? Have you got a frog pond? No. Has your neighbour's got a frog pond? No. How do you think frogs are going to still be on your back step 10 years later if no one's got a frog pond? If they haven't got somewhere to breed, they can't breed in your toilet because you keep flushing it, alright? It goes down the sewage plant and those birds that I was talking about earlier, they're waiting for them and they clean them all up and take them. 15 years this guy lived for, happily on your back step, sitting under your light, eating the cockroaches or anything else that's coming towards your back door. All you got to do is have somewhere for it to safely breed. And then you will always have green tree frogs on your back step, in your toilet if you're allowed to be there. I often get asked how you get them out of your toilet. I say you close your eyes and put your hands really quickly. They come and go. They'll come through the pipes. I've actually seen footage of the large stormwater drains around Brisbane and Ipswich, where if you go down into the stormwater and sewage drain, there's thousands of these guys down there. They're just living down there because it's moist, always moist. They're living happily, there's thousands of insects running around and they're feeding and they're happy. When it comes summer, they'll come out to the surface, they'll look to breed and then they go back down again. So it's not hard to keep these froggies. From a big green tree frog to something like a little ornate burrowing frog. Just to give you an idea of wetland and adaptation. So this guy here couldn't climb up a wall if it was paid to. Because a green tree frog's happy to stand on a window surface vertically. Not a problem. Climb up that wall and climb off and into a downpipe or whatever else. If this guy comes up against anything bigger than about that, it's stuck. Alright, can't climb out. So swimming pools are death traps for this thing. It gets in there, swims around, it can't get out unless the water's overflowing or you've left a rope or something like that in. That's a chance for me to just mention. If you have a swimming pool, please leave a little rope or something that hangs over that edge. Unless you've got one of those gradual rocky edges, you got a swimming pool, get a decent bit of rope, tie it off to the fence and just have it hanging in the pool. Anything that falls in there, swim around, find that bit of rope and it can get itself out. Southeast Queensland, we have about 4 to 10 koalas a year drowning swimming pools. All they need is something to get a hold of so they can get themselves out, alright? We don't do that, we don't deserve to have them in the first place. That's what it comes down to. It's not hard to do. But this little frog burrows. So when it's around wetlands and areas like that, it needs soft soil. The compacted ground is no use to this frog. It actually uses, it's got little knobs on its back feet and it scuffles like this and it buries itself down into the ground. Gets down far enough that it keeps its moisture. Come the rainy season, they come out, they feed, they breed. They usually breed, and most frogs prefer to breed in non-permanent water. So they're like ephemeral wetlands that are dry one day, full of water the next. Anyone know why? Sorry? Yeah. Usually in those ephemeral areas that just filled up the big large puddles as such. There isn't eels and fish and all these other things that are frog predators. So it's much safer to go into them to breed and it's much safer for their young. So that's where these guys are breeding. I would suspect, and I know I can remember back, much as I hope you met 30 plus years ago, the great toad hunts were on in southeast Queensland. And council used to have toad nights and they'd get everyone to run off around Blueberry Creek or they'd run around Rhodey Road and Downfall Creek bushland catching the toads to try and eradicate the toads. What fools, but we'll get to toads in a minute. I used to go to those nights and sit there and go, that's not a toad, that's not a toad, that's not a toad. Anything that was small and brown and wasn't a big green tree frog was considered a toad. And people were catching them and dragging them in and knocking them off. Easily confused with a baby toad. But it's not. I have to take 2 seconds and just have a good look at it. It's nothing like a toad. It's quite hard to hold on to. It's very slippery, whereas the old toads are quite easy to get a hold of and things like that. But frogs are quite variable. They're all the same species. They are all that's frog. Can't get them wrong if you know what you're doing. They always have these bars on their lips, no matter what form or morph they're in. And they always have this little bit of a hard patterning around the back of their eyes. And they've always got some form of barring on their legs. Flip them over, they don't have the mottled belly like the cane toads do. And yeah, a little bit of time and you soon realise that that's not a cane toad. But they are why sometimes a frog book that's got one picture may not be of much use to you. Some frogs are very consistent. They all look exactly the same. And other frogs, quite a bit of variety. You know how to identify frogs? You know, I was talking earlier about go down to your wetland and find out what frogs are there. I'm not suggesting to you to try and catch or find a frog. Because anyone who thinks they're doing that's kidding themselves. Because you can spend hours thinking, where is it? Where the hell is it? And as soon as you move, it shuts up. And as soon as you walk away, back again looking for it. All you have to do, I'll bet 99% of you all have a mobile phone in your pocket. Pull that phone out, record, go home in the comfort of your house with a nice cold beer or a cup of coffee, go onto the Frog Society's website, play some of the calls until you hear one similar, listen to the call on your phone, and before you know it, you've just identified what frog you were hearing down in the wetland. We used to do frog surveys where we sat in Brisbane drinking red wine and eating pizza. And we had our volunteers running around the wetlands on rainy nights getting drenched. And they would phone us up and hold the phone to all the frogs calling. And we'd sit in town saying, where are you, Minippy Wetlands? And write down what frogs we could hear on the phone. That's wonderful, great job. But that's better. You get 3 or 4 experts, they can't cover anywhere near others can. So you're using the resources that are available to try and achieve this. Probably the most common frog in southeast Queensland, if not Queensland in its own way, alright? The striped marsh frog. Anywhere where there's a bit of a ditch and a few reeds or a bit of grass, and walking past there day or night often, that's this guy. There are quite a few people out there who built frog ponds near their bedroom window. Isn't that lovely? Wow, got a little wetland that's on my window. I go to bed at night. Then come the rainy nights, the tree frogs and everyone's in there. Think about where you're putting your frog ponds, alright? You don't like a neighbour, put it right up against their fence. Help move them on. But this guy, very common. But again, very hard to find. You can hear that. And you're looking, but if you imagine a bit of old rank grass and a bit of mud all flopped over, and he's just sitting in amongst it, very hard to find. Because at the same time, there's an egret and an ibis and everything else standing there, hoping to spot him as well. Frogs mean food. Everything eats frogs. You never ever want to be a frog. They must spend their entire life looking around and worrying about. They get in the water, there's something in there one eat them. They come out, there's something outside one eat. Even to the point of centipedes and things like that, knock them off. We have rare frogs that are very unique and uniquely Australian. So this one's Mixophes flayi, named after David Clay. Now this is a frog that's only found in the, not only, but primarily found in the more sort of rainforest, wet sclerophyll streams. And it's a frog that you can see here. It's rather aquatic, large wet feet, spends quite a bit of time in the water. What's different about these guys? We have the more common one that we get around here, which is the great barred frog, alright? Mixophes fasciculatus. It's very common in various areas. But there's something about these guys that needs consideration when we're doing management of wetlands and drainage lines. The common one has disappeared from certain areas around Brisbane, and it's quite simply because back in the day, if you had a bit of a stream and a creek, the ideal thing to do was to straighten it up, concrete it, and get that water flushing out so that you didn't have mosquitoes and when storm water, the water would go. And then when there's no rain, it's just a dry concrete drain. These guys, when they lay their eggs, or when she lays her eggs and he fertilises them, they are a year as a tadpole. They're a very large, very jungle tadpole, but they need a permanent body of water that lasts through the winter. And that's why they're up mostly in those larger streams where you get ponds forming along the waterway. And without that, you don't have it. So again, that permanent water, unlike some of the other frogs that use the ephemeral wetlands in that sense. I love wood swallows. Magic little birds, but again, one that, find them anywhere. If you go to Townsville, they're in every street, they're on every power line, and every corner of every part of that area of the world. Down here, still quite common, but certainly more primarily associated with wetland and marine environments and things like that. And they're a bird, feeds basically on the invertebrates that are flying around those wetlands, and that's what they do. Without some of the wetlands maintained, you'd see a drop in the bird numbers. No two ways about it. That relationship that's there between the two. I've got to watch my time. Am I going too long and going? Not at all? Cool. Now, if someone's going to pick up a frog and mistake it for a toad, there's probably one there. If it didn't have that big thing rolled out there. Toads don't have the large vocal sacs like a lot of our frogs do. That basically works like the acoustic guitar that's over in the back corner there. It's just a large hollow, so it resonates. So you can get this little tiny frog making this very loud, very large noise. And often when I take people out frogging, they get stunned how little that thing is that was making all that noise in that little wetland or that little puddle. And this guy here, no bigger than that. Alright, that photo doesn't quite do it justice, but you can see a bit of a gum leaf or something there. If you were to put that on its back, you realise a gum leaf's sticking out. Now that's Euparyllia, that one. Musker, I believe, but it's just there. That's what they do. That's what a frog does. That's how it calls. Only males call. So when you can't sleep at night, it's the boys. Alright, it's not the girls. They don't make noise. Male frogs calling, attracting the females to suitable breeding. So it's not unless there's good breeding that they'll be calling. Some frog species you can trick them. So if I was to get a tape recorder, and if you had green tree frogs here, and I started to play green tree frog calls, they'll often respond. And that's a bit like teenage boys in a disco. If they think there's something happening, they all want to join in, they don't want to miss out, right? They'll start calling too. If he's calling, I'm not missing out. That's no two ways about it. So that's what it is. And they generally attract the females over. As a rule, female frogs are bigger than male frogs. What? Yeah, it generally helps on her and often well away from the breeding habitat, and she's got to carry him and all the eggs to the breeding environments. Alright? So, as a rule, they're big. Breeding time, mostly in the water. Some frogs lay on the edges of water, some frogs lay in little tiny holes next to water, or actually in dry drainage lines. And we have a local frog, Pseudophony raveni and Pseudophony major and all of that genus. Get myself in trouble here on video. Party frog we used to call him, because they lay, it's one of the ones that the adult actually looks after the eggs. So they have this little hole, the female will lay in there and the male fertilises those eggs. And the male sits there and looks after those eggs. And they're in like a little tiny pearl. And the tadpoles slowly develop up in there to a certain point. And it almost stops at that point. Daddy sits there keeping the ants away, keeping other things away, feeding and just protecting the hole so that things don't come and take it. When it rains and that ditch fills up, the water starts flowing through, those little eggs instantly pop open, and there is an almost mature tadpole or semi-ready to go frog in there. So, when I'm using the term party frog, if you get some of those eggs, you can get a little glass of water and drop them in, and it's magic. Instantly a little tadpole appears in the water. But that's the uniqueness of some of these frogs and the different strategies that they've adopted. Very common one locally. Anyone know him? Yeah, that's our bobolink. One of the great things about frog names, you wonder who it was that came up with the common name and where it comes from, because he's called the scarlet-sided bobolink. He's sort of got scarlet just about everywhere except on his sides. He's got scarlet in under his arms and scarlets in various places, but rarely on their sides. So that's quite a large frog. Bobolink, because they're sitting in the water, and bonk, 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 quite loud. You'll hear them certain times. I call it the honesty frog. He's the only male frog that's in there actually saying what's on his mind. Our red egg. We need common frog around here, little dwarf tree frog. Almost anywhere where there's a bit of long grass and some reeds, or, you know, often living in shade houses and people's yards all over the place. Very similar to that, but that's not it. That's the very, very rare Latoria longorensis, or Wallam sedge frog, he is. And he's only found in the Wallam swamps. Generally, so on all the sand islands and on the marine, the true Wallam, and usually where there's that weedy habitat. They breed, this guy and a few other species, they are specialists on the low pH waters. They're generally termed the acid frogs. You know, kids hear that and they think, oh, it's a bit acid or blah blah, but no, it's the water. They breed in quite low pH water. One of the important things for that species, or that group of frogs, is when they're building roads or drainage lines or putting in urban estates near them, changes in hydrology in the water flow and the water flow paths can have significant impact on these guys. Because if you're suddenly pouring a whole lot more fresh water into those swamps and that pH comes back up a bit more, they can still breeding that often, but what happens is it gets up enough that I'll make striped marsh frog and a few of those other ones we were looking at earlier, that suddenly becomes habitat suitable for them, and they will outcompete slowly but surely and push these guys out just out of sheer numbers and sheer weight numbers. So yeah, it's horses for courses in that sense. Why would he have a picture of a wallaby? We're talking about wetlands, for goodness sake. Swamp wallaby, that's why. Now, again, an unfortunate name, in that although they're called swamp wallaby, you can go out into central Queensland in some of the driest, hardest mulga country, and swamp wallabies are still hopping around and still doing their thing out there. But in a general sense, this species is associated with the wetter, particularly around Brisbane. Redneck wallabies love that open pasture and the open golf fields and all of those sorts of things. Swamp wallabies tend to like more cover, and they'd be hiding more in that longer grass and things like that over there. Redneck wallabies are feeding on grasses and a variety of things. These guys tend to more eat ferns and fungi and all sorts of variety of foods, and associated more with wetlands. The reason I've got that one there, that's the golden swamp wallaby. So technically still the same species, but that's the one that's found on the Bay Islands and on the back of Stradbroke Island, South Stradbroke Island and some of those areas. It's a golden form, and in its own way, a unique biodiversity in its own right. It's, you know, I've had this argument in the past with people, because if you talk to a true taxonomist, they'll say, look, we've pulled the skulls out and we've compared them with the swamp wallaby and it's the same species. And it's like, yeah, well it is. But that's a golden form. There's something unique about that, and this is the only place that they're found. So don't they warrant some kind of recognition? Shouldn't we be identifying golden swamp wallabies as unique in some way or another? But they don't. So these guys, yeah, that's over on the islands, and that's probably behind it a good example of an acid swamp where you find those rarer acid frogs breeding. That's a semi-permanent wetland that would fill up, and that low pH water comes from the plants and everything around it. What do we do with wetlands? What are wetlands for and all of those sorts of things? What's the future of our wetlands? Now, we go out and look at most wetlands in southeast Queensland. What's your first impression of them?
They're good to have, you know, it's good to,
good to have.
Part of the
Yep.
They're
I mean, most of them, when I look at them, I think, what a weed-infested mess. What a disaster. Where do I start to rehabilitate this swamp? It's absolutely dominated by paragrasses and all sorts of introduced weeds and all sorts of things. Cane toads in there breeding by the thousand, and all of these sorts of other negative things that spring to mind when you look at it. But they're actually doing relatively well, most of our wetlands. And some of those weeds, and I say this because I'm talking to a bush care orientated group, a lot of those weeds have high values for the species that are living there. The last thing you want to do is turn up at that swamp and start spraying the entire lot of paragrass and taking it out of that system. Alright? Work at it, chip away at it, spray bits, replace it, but think about the things that are living in there. They need habitat and cover during that transitional period. If you're going to bring back natives, then do it, and do it slowly. Work your way through and get native species back up. And it's a challenge. But other things, when I look at our wetlands and stuff, you see the stormwater drains poked directed straight into them. Think about all the things that are coming off those roads, the rubbish and all of that sort of stuff that comes down those drains. These are all management issues for our wetlands that we as a community need to think about and have challenges with. We've got to change in the future. Now, global warming and climate change. Alright? I think it's good that Australian people might soon have governments and leaders that recognise science and don't just ignore it and carry on regardless in their own way. But certainly at the federal level, we have somehow it's turning a blind eye to some of these issues in the short term. The short-term issues that people are just not paying attention to in the long term. And global warming and climate change, when you put it into the wetland context, what does it mean? Well, some wetlands means they're going to flood more often. They're going to flood a lot more often and have a lot more water coming into them. You're going to have storm surges coming up those creeks. So what today is a freshwater wetland is going to become an estuarine wetland with salt influences and things like that. This happens naturally in wetlands and along waterways. Different times you get a big hunk of mud come down, it'll push up and it changes where the water goes. And within any one area, there's often, when I was saying before about a dynamic environment, there's often these sorts of changes going on. And when you get a big flood event, it cleans it all out again, and then it all goes back to fresh water, it all opens back up to estuarine and those sorts of things. But in other areas, these wetlands are going to dry out a lot faster. They're going to dry out more longer and for longer. And some of those species that have evolved and lived with those wetlands are going to have to deal with that. Some will, some won't. Some will push them beyond what is their ability to live. And it is something that happens. Good example is this particular orchid. Now that's a fias orchid. Now that's found basically in the coastal strip, generally around the edges, just beyond where the marine influence is, and in the melaleuca and the freshwater environments just around those edges. Quite rare. Don't let that picture fool you. That hand is like that. That thing standing up there looking at you. It's no small little crowned orchid. That is a massive, big, large orchid. Much sought after orchid. It's its own worst enemy. It's so big and so pretty, people just can't help but go and dig them out, tow and take them home and grow them to 99% of the time complete failure. Right? So when they get found these days, there's a lot of the ecologists just don't tell people that they're there. The Tugun bypass is a classic example. There was a community meeting about that bypass. One of the things was the rare acid frogs and stuff, and there was fias orchids. And a map got put up that showed where all these things were, and 2 days later, Those fire orchids were not dead. Gone. Never back there again.
Every one of them was taken.
Every single one. Dug up and taken. Now, you tend to think it's someone in the nursery trade or whatever, but certainly someone in that audience got some information and acted on it within, a very, very short
I think it
time.
was someone that wanted that road to go dead straight through.
Probably. Could have been the proponent themselves. It's always hard to know. But if you suddenly start getting a lot larger storm surges, a lot more push in those storm surges up onto what is the freshwater environments, this species is one of those ones that somehow has to learn it's got to retreat. It's got to retreat further away from that influence in a very short time. And it's unlikely that that's going to happen. And it's hard to grasp all of these sorts of things. This guy's mad. He's got photos of galahs talking about wetlands. One of the species that's able to inhabit some of the driest, most arid environments in the world. Flying around the central Queensland and out through the outback in large numbers. Why? Why would I have a picture of them? Still need water. Still need somewhere to drink. And if you're a galah or a sulphur-crested cockatoo or a budgie or any of those other things that are out in those dry environments, they're only there while they've still got access to water. And they're a good example of particularly things like the budgies and the diamond doves and things like that. When the rains hit out there, when those wetlands fill up, that's when the boom happens and they breed. And we go out to some of those areas and there is just millions of them. They're everywhere, absolutely everywhere. Full colour, beautiful colour, healthy, gleaming, yay, wonderful. The swamp rats and all those things are booming. The raptors are all breeding because there's so many other things to feed on, and it all just, it's alive. And it all starts to dry out and dry out. And then all of that breeding and boom stuff, you can go out there 3 months later and it is such a different world. You struggle finding some of those things that you were seeing thousands of in that same place. And that's a good example of the dynamic wetlands. It's got a carpet pipe. Why? It doesn't really need to drink water. Plenty of tucker. And when I put him into our local context, a lot of these swamps and wetland areas are where all the rats and mice and stuff tend to breed up. And you can often, there wouldn't be a wetland in southeast Queensland that didn't have a few resident guys hanging around, feeding and cleaning up what would otherwise be a pest for that local area. The old black swamp down in Cleveland, I mean these guys, it's incredible the density of them around that swamp. And it's to do with how many ibis breed there and how many rats are around the place and the industrial area next door and all the rats and stuff that are there. And flying foxes feed on them and all of those various things. So it's a balance, Without the food source, you don't get the predators in that sense. Predators. Darters, cormorants and all of those, birds that just love a good freshwater wetland that's alive and got all those lovely fish trapped in this area here, and I can just dive on in and clean them all up. I can remember as a kid my father building a pond. And my father was not into environment and ecology. He was one of these people that, God bless his soul, a dead snake is a good snake. He just did not get environment at all. He was really from the old school in that context. And putting a pond in wasn't for frogs. It wasn't for natives, or it was to look good and to put some goldfish and have some goldfish, right? Big pond, it's lovely. near killed him digging it out, cementing it. Down the road, by the plants, put the plants in. Down the pet shop, look, these lovely big goldfish, put them in there. Stood there looking at them. Isn't that wonderful? Look at that, it's lovely. And he went up inside, and I reckon by the time he had his cup of tea, and had finished that and got back downstairs, there was one goldfish left in that pond. Because these guys had been sitting there waiting the entire time. And as soon as he turned his back, poof, they were gone. That beautiful pond ended up with chunks of the reinforcement, that slapped all over it till it looked like a water jail to stop the birds and things getting it. When really all it needed was some more reeds and some more cover, so those fish had places to hide and weren't so exposed. But you know, if you're a bright goldfish in a little pond, you can't blame these guys for coming in and cleaning them up. You know, and if you're ever catching the barge and stuff over Australia, it's a bird, it's fresh water, it's marine environments as well. Same as the cormorants, they can go into your boat and they'll take the fish from boat. And quite impressive how big a fish that bird can actually get down that throat, to the point where you see its throat which is bulged as it's trying to get it down. Right? So they're very effective. Talk about climate change, they're probably one of the birds. It won't faze them too much. So though the changes happen, but because they've got the marine and the fresh water and they can hit such a variety of things, they're probably still going to do alright in that sense. With climate change and wetlands, you know, there's a lot of people don't understand climate change, don't understand the variety of it. But there has been studies, and there is very good proof that global warming is true. And on that, I will finish up my talk and invite you for questions.
Adrian, you were going to touch on toads.
Oh yes, toads.
Person
Yeah.
that's got a pond at home and I don't have any more frogs in it. Do the toads keep the frogs away? Or
Not really. Not really. Now, the cane toad, we'll spend 5 minutes on cane toad, right? I've got 5 minutes, have I? The cane toad introduction to Australia was a disaster. No two ways about it, all right? Some dropkick put a cane toad in a box with some cane beetles and it ate them, and that was about as scientific as that was. Alright, here's something that will clean up the cane beetle that was causing massive disasters up in the sugar cane belts. Now you think about a cane toad, where do you see cane toads? On the ground? What sort of ground? Generally mowed ground and open ground. Have you ever seen a cane toad in amongst long, thick, matted grass? Never. Because they're clumsy. You compare a toad with most frogs, they're very clumsy and they're stuck on the ground, and a thick grassy environment is almost impenetrable to them. So they love golf courses, schoolyards, parks, walkways and all of these sorts of areas. Their natural environments actually a closed rainforest where the understory has very little growing because it's closed. It's all shaded out. So they generally live in a leaf-lit understory, and that's what they do. And they let them go in North Queensland. Cane beetles stayed up on the top of the cane as they always do, causing all the damage. And the cane toads looked at the cane fields and went, well, bugger that, I can't get through there, I'll go on the golf club. And they've gone elsewhere, and they've found this environment, whether we've got these permanent pondage areas with nice mow right up to the edge. They get into that water and they breed like mad. Now, a female cane toad in her peak can have, I forget how many, but it's thousands of offspring. Those eggs are poisonous. Those tadpoles are poisonous. Those baby toads are poisonous. You know, you go to a pondage area in the daytime, you can see tadpoles, big numbers of them, all around the edge. They're toads. So they weren't toads, there'd be something there eating them. Native tadpoles don't hang around the edge in the daytime up where everything can just come along and eat them. So they're very successful. I'm going to balance this out. They've got a bad rap too. You hear a lot of people say, oh, the cane toad caused the green tree frogs to go extinct and the cane toad that made this happen. Rubbish. Alright? Rubbish. We, the community, are the ones that are making most of these things disappear. The cane toads had significant impact on a couple of things, but they're mostly things that predate on cane toads. So it's only the stuff that eat an adult cane toad and get poisoned that drop off. Death adders, goannas, quolls, species like that. But the frogs, there is not a single frog anywhere in the distribution of cane toad in Australia which has gone extinct or in trouble as a result of cane toads. Alright? Cane toads compete with them, don't get me wrong. If you're that little ornate burrowing frog hopping down to the water and there's a big toad there and you're going past him, you're probably going to get eaten. Alright? They will knock the numbers down. But that's frogs. Frogs as a strategy. Breed in numbers, spread out in numbers, get eaten in numbers, and a few of us make it back to the water to breed again. The cane toads are not eating every single frog that comes out of the water in that sense. So, as we think about our ponds and our wetlands, and I'll bring it back to the backyard. Got a pond, don't have green tree frogs in it, but I have toads. Yeah, there's probably not a single one of you that don't have toads in your backyard. You may not know it, but if you go out there some night and wave a torch around, you will find a toad. You'll find a toad up to about that big. Now there's a few people in this room that are elderly towards that end of the scale. Been in southeast Queensland for 40 odd years, I hope. Remember when toads first started coming around? Do you remember how many toads were in your backyard 25 years ago? Open your back door, they're just there. Hundreds of them. Big toads. Massive things. What's changed?
They aren't there in numbers anymore.
Sorry?
They aren't there in numbers anymore.
They're not there in numbers anymore. And how long since you've seen a toad bigger than that? Our native wildlife, nature's a wonderful thing in its own way. In that, if there's an abundance of something, there's usually a response to that resource. It's generally thought that it was the crows, and crows are pretty clever old birds. You know, crows have a society, they talk, young that run amok and cause trouble, and the older ones get a bit more sedate and etc. And they have the grandparents. And toads generally, as a rule, toads, crows, and a lot of things, you know, bats in a camp, the young are on the inside, the breeding adults around them, and around the very outside are all the older generations. So if a seagull comes in, he's taking grandma who's not breeding anymore, rather than the young, the future, and all of those sorts of things. Now the old crows, as a rule, started to see these toads still hopping around. A couple would have a try at eating them, because yeah, it's just like a frog, why not? Dog. Well, Grandma, you want to have another try at that? You want to try one? Maybe eat half of it. Maybe just take the legs, maybe do that. But eventually, through trial and error, they've worked out that there's big poisonous glands on the shoulders. The skin's generally poisonous. But if you bust them open, you can hollow out all that yummy gooey stuff that's called organs and stuff on the inside and eat that with impunity. And next time you're walking along and you see a dead toad somewhere, old dried out thing, flip it over and you'll probably find that it's had its stomach ripped open. And that's the crows that started that. foxes are eating them. They've learnt from the crows probably that yeah, that's what you can do. You can hollow out the inside. Now ibis, they can't tear open a stomach. They've got this big stupid beak that doesn't really work like that. But you can step on them and get that big beak and smash it through its head and pull it inside out and gobble it up that way and leave all those poisonous bits behind. So our natives are starting to clean them up. We have a couple of turtles that can feed on the tadpoles and on baby toads. But, yep.
So is it the keelback snake that
Keelback snake can feed on them. He's one. Keelback snake's it's kind of almost evolutionary in its own way. But that's a snake. The keelback snake's associated with water and wetlands, and you won't really find them far away. So it's going to always be feeding on those sorts of things. Keelbacks can certainly eat toads. Keelbacks rarely get bigger than about that and around that, so they can only really feed on the smaller ones. Generally speaking, if they have an entire diet of toad, they don't do well in the long term. But they can feed on toads as long as they're still feeding on other things as well. That's how I understand that. But things are starting to take this abundant resource and bring it back into balance. Cane toads are here to stay. Alright? They're naturalised Australian. We've given them a passport, we've patted them on the head, and they planted a wobble tree at the ceremony or something. But they're here, alright? I get really worried. I hear about studies to eradicate the toad. And as much as I'd love to go, no toads in Australia. Myself, I think, anything that's going to knock out a toad, all those variety of frogs we talked about earlier, some of them are going to be susceptible. So they talk about introducing diseases and rusts. They call them rusts, which are just like funguses and things that are species specific that will only affect toads. Yeah, just like so many other things that have been introduced and will only affect this, it doesn't. But once it's got out to the wild, it's run amok with other things. Now back to your pond. Frog pond in the yard. How do we stop toads at the frog pond? There's two ways. Two ways of doing it. One, being out there constantly at night, catching them, tossing them over the neighbour's fence or down the road or whatever else you do. We might touch on humane treatment of toads in a minute. Generally, try and have a thick edge to your pond. So lots of reeds, lots of things planted up. Now it's not necessarily the tidy open look that people envisage for their frog pond, but that's one of the best ways of keeping a toad from regularly using your pond. Having an edge, and I often use it, but the striped marsh frogs and the ornate barren frogs I talked about earlier, they hate this answer because it keeps them out too. But put a pond up, have it up high, off the ground, whether it's on a table, a broccoli box can be a frog pond. Plonk it down, put some water in there, a couple of plants in it, walk away, and if you've got green tree frogs, they'll find that and they'll breed in that very happily. And a toad will never get to it ever. Alright? But that's not, again, the vision that most people have when they think about a frog pond. So the only other way of really doing it is getting small fencing, yay-high type fencing that you put down and around your pond. Because most frogs happily get over that quite easily and get to the pond, whereas a toad hits it and it's a wall and they just go around it. So when we're trapping wildlife, we use little fences, we run fences, and we dig buckets in the ground. And things that run along, they hit the fence and just run along the fence like it's a log. They don't really know what a plastic bucket is, and they generally think they can get out. And they just run and drop in, and they're in there and they can't get out. So we get all the frogs and small reptiles and some mice and stuff That's how we catch them in our buckets. Control of toads. I'll be honest, I don't really advocate it. I don't, if you go in your backyard and you dispatch a toad, there's just 10 others, 1,000 others just waiting to take its place. So unless you want to spend your life being, euthanasia person and going around killing toads all the time, you're really kidding yourself. You're better off creating good habitats that just keep the natives up and encouraging other species that will feed and control those toads. Kookaburras, now known to feed on them. They have a different strategy. They catch them, they fly out from the tree, and they just whack the living hell out of them. Because the toad, that poison, that comes out on impact. So it's designed for when a snake or something grabs them. That's when that poison comes out. Oh, Cookie, he just smashes them until all of that poison's out. Just keeps whacking and whacking and whacking them until it's all gone. Flies down into a bit of water, washes them off, cleans them up. Gone, you're mine. So different things are learned in different ways of dealing with them. But yeah, I don't have an answer on how to not have toads. Unless you're in one of those yards where you've got those colour bond fences that are hard down on the ground against a bit of concrete, and it entirely goes around your property, and you go and clean up all the toads that are in there and toss them out, you might have a hope. But then again, that is stopping almost everything else other than birds and stuff from coming into your yard. So you would need to almost bring tadpoles in. I'm going to use that as a lead into moving of tadpoles, and people often have this, there was this craze 15 years ago about frog tadpole swapping and all this sort of stuff in southeast Queensland. We used to have these, I used to call them frog parties, where people would bring all their tadpoles along and people would collect and get, here's your 10. And it was a membership drive. You had to be a member of the group, so you pay your $10 and you get your tadpoles on the way out after a talk type thing and take them home and start your frog pop. Now that was moving, I'd have to say it's unlikely to have caused any real drama in that most of the genetics in those species weren't travelling very far, but you did get the odd person there. They're on holidays from Cloncurry and they're going to take them back to breed up there. And you think, well, that's not real good. The species not even found in Cloncurry. You're going to introduce a whole new species in your local area. Chitted virus, which is the frog, a disease that's causing a lot of the decline in our local frogs. And that is easily transported through people swapping tadpoles, taking things from one wetland catchment to another wetland catchment and things like that. So you need to be very conscious if you're doing any of that sort of stuff. There is guides online and there is protocols there. And for people like myself, if we go and work in a particular catchment or wetland, if we're doing scoop netting or stuff to see what's in the water, when we finish, boots have got to be disinfected, all that equipment's got to be disinfected and cleaned off before we go to the next catchment. Stop transporting those diseases. I think I've covered cane toads, but yeah.
Do cane toads like salt water?
Their name's Buffo marinus, and yeah, they can tolerate, you toss them into the ocean, they've got real problems. Alright, it's a bit too high, but immediately behind the intertidal zone, or where there's some salt influence, that's ideal for them, because most of our frogs can't go in there, but he can, or they can. And they'll breed quite happily in some of those estuarine swamps and things like that native frogs aren't using. So, hence why, certainly some of the islands and things, there's massive numbers of toads because there is so much breeding habitat for them in those areas. So, yeah. Any other questions? All bored to death by now, I can see, that's good. Heather asked me to put you all to sleep because she wants to run around and pick your pockets while you're all sleeping. So she calls it donations, but you know, we've got other names for it. But yeah, wetlands, certainly, to round up, next time you're out and about and you're going for a drive, pull up, have a look at a wetland and think about whether it's permanent, semi-permanent, how many varieties, whether it's got open water, deep water, shallow water, little rivets and runlets and things like that. And all of those are all little ecotones or micro-environments that will have different species. And a lot of people don't realise that there are certain elements to habitats that without them you won't have that species. So you can plant all of the whatever you like in your backyard, but to get, you know, that Mixophes flayi or some of those other frogs there, it just won't happen because you don't have the whole environment. You've just got elements of it. So keep it real in that sense. All right. Thank you very much.